Shevchenko Lecture, which is the Institute's most eminent and oldest invited lecture. In early March, either on the day of Taras Shevchenko's birth, March 9, or on the day of his death, March 10, the Institute traditionally convenes to celebrate and commemorate the most powerful voice of Ukraine, the voice of Ukraine's most prominent poet who dedicated his entire life fighting for the right of Ukrainians to be free. Normally, it is indeed a celebratory occasion, yet there has never been a more somber time to host our distinguished speakers than this year. We gather today while witnessing with much pain the devastation, death, and ruins left at the hand of Russia's ongoing brutal assault on Ukrainian sovereignty, territorial integrity, independence, and nationhood. Since the end of the World War II, Europe and the world indeed has not seen a war of such scope and proportion, of such brutality as the war Putin had unleashed on Ukraine just 14 days ago. The Russian president made it clear in his numerous public addresses that in his wild imagination, Ukraine should not exist as an independent nation, as a sovereign country and a democratic state. Thus, the world is now witnessing in disbelief Putin's war designed to restore Russian neo-imperial dominance over the nation of Ukraine. Shevchenko, a poet, an artist, and cultural and spiritual leader of Ukrainians, fought this very imperial thinking and Russian colonial oppression of Ukraine his entire life, some century and a half ago. The most powerful and unifying cultural symbol, his words have been an inspiration in times of peace and a call for action in times of war. Today, as in no other time, his words lead Ukrainian fighters in their battle against the Russian army, against the Russian neocolonial expansion and vicious, brutal occupation of Ukraine. And in Shevchenko's word, though, in our land, by faith renewed, no foeman shall remain. Mothers and sons shall show their worth, and people shall reign. We have contemplated the idea of canceling this year's lecture, and so the Institute and you, dear guests, will be able to focus on most pressing needs these difficult days. We all face those. And yet giving up wouldn't be in Shevchenko's spirit, and certainly it is not in the spirit of our institute with its mandate to create, preserve, and disseminate knowledge about Ukraine and Ukrainians in the world. So we decided to proceed. The annual Shevchenko Lecture is conceived to be a place where many come together to partake in important discussions concerning Ukrainian history, language, literature, culture, identity, and nation building. It is a place where a thoughtful and engaging dialogue is pursued across different disciplines, differing viewpoints, and diverse voices on the meanings and interpretations of Ukraine's past and present. Importantly, like the Institute itself, the establishment of the Shevchenko Lecture is a result of collaboration between the academics and the Ukrainian-Canadian community. And the first lecture was held in 1966. Really 10 years even before the Institute was founded. It was sponsored back then by a Ukrainian-Canadian Professional and Business Association of Edmonton, an organization that supported the founding of the Institute as well. CIUS is proud of our long-standing partnership that illustrates our commitment to building and disseminating knowledge about Ukrainians in the world together. I invite now Mr. Wlodko Boychuk, the board member of the Ukrainian-Canadian Professional Business Association of Edmonton and the president of the Alberta Foundation for Ukrainian Education Society, the organizations jointly sponsoring our event today. Wlodko will share his greetings on behalf of our community partners. Mr. Boychuk, please, the screen is yours.
Щиро дякую, доктора Ханенко-Фрізен. Thank you very much. Спочатку я хочу привітати нашого доповідача, доктора Франка Сисина, і всіх учасників цьогорічної Шевченківської лекції від імені наших двох громадських організацій, які щороку спонсорують цю Шевченківську лекцію. On behalf of the Ukrainian-Canadian Professional Business Association of Edmonton and Alberta Foundation for Ukrainian Education Society, or AFUS, I would like to thank the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies for many years of collaboration in organizing our annual Shevchenko Lectures. Over the years, we have had so many excellent speakers who have touched on a wide variety of Ukrainian topics. However, this year's Shevchenko Lecture is dealing with the topic of Ukrainian Studies, which is so close and dear to our hearts here in Canada. Dr. Frank Sysyn has been directly involved in Ukrainian studies for so many years and in different cities, so we're looking forward to his in-depth analysis of this topic. So, on behalf of our two organizations, I would like to welcome Dr. Frank Sysyn at the 56th Annual Shevchenko Lecture. Ще раз дякую за цю можливість і бажаю всього найкращого. I'm passing the mic back to you, Dr. Hanenko-Friesen.
Дуже дякую, пане Бойчук. Thank you very much. And allow me now to introduce our esteemed, distinguished speaker, my dear colleague, Dr. Frank Sysyn. Dr. Sysyn is the director of the Peter Jacyk Centre for Ukrainian Historical Research at the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies. He's also a professor in the Department of History, Classics, and Religious Studies at the University of Alberta, and the chief editor of the Hrushevsky translation project, the English translation of the multi-volume history of Ukraine-Rus. Altogether, there have been 12 amazing volumes produced by his team. Dr. Sysyn, also the head of the executive committee of the Holodomor Research and Education Consortium at the Institute, a member of the editorial board of Harvard Ukrainian Studies, and a member of the editorial board of East-West, the Journal of Ukrainian Studies, two leading journals in our field, published in English language. Dr. Sysyn is heading also the advisory board for the Ukrainian program at the Harriman Institute. Professor Sysyn has taught at numerous universities, namely University of Alberta, Harvard University, Columbia University, Stanford University, and other institutions. A specialist in East Central European history, he is the author of many, many publications, books, and collections of essays. Between Poland and Ukraine, The Dilemma of Adam Kisiel, Mykhailo Hrushevsky, historian and national awakener, studies on the Khmelnytsky uprising, Ukrainian historiography, early modern Ukrainian political culture, modern Ukrainian religious history, and the Holodomor. Dr. Sysyn has co-authored with Serhiy Plokhy, Religion and Nation in Modern Ukraine, 2003. He is a co-editor with Martin Schultz's Vessel of Religion, Nation, and Secularization in Ukraine, 2015. He is a co-author with Andrea Graziosi of Communism in Hungary, the Ukrainian, Chinese, Kazakh, and Slovene famines. The book has come out in 2016, and recently published Genocide, The Power and Problems of a Concept, a book which is published in 2022. He's an editor-in-chief of 3-volume collected work of Father Mykhailo Zubrytsky. At CIUS, Harvard, and elsewhere, Frank provided or proved to be rather a key agent in the mobilization of Ukrainian studies outside of Ukraine over the last half a century, really. Lending CIUS his diverse talents, Frank helped to transform our institution into a powerful, globally recognized intellectual powerhouse. University of Alberta is very proud of all his accomplishments. Recently, we at the Institute, as well as the rest of the intellectual community in Ukrainian studies, celebrated Frank's 75th anniversary. In recognition of Dr. Sysyn's lifelong accomplishments and in celebration of Frank's immense intellectual legacy, the Institute unanimously decided to invite Frank to deliver the annual Shevchenko Lecture 2022. Frank kindly agreed. Today, I'm very privileged and pleased to finally introduce Dr. Sysyn's presentation titled In Pursuit of the Past and the Future, Reflections on a Career in Ukrainian Studies from the 1960s to the 2020s. Thank you very much, Dr. Sysyn. The floor is yours.
I thank you very much. And we all realize that this lecture is delivered at such difficult times for our brothers and sisters in Ukraine. And I would argue in the midst of a world crisis. And this makes, of course, it difficult to turn to what might be viewed as my personal story, which is part of what we will hear today. So I will try and limit the personal in a degree, but I will try and fulfill the reason I was asked to give this. Obviously, there is a desire now to record the development of Ukrainian studies, to document it, and to look back to its founding in North America and its development over a longer period of time. So I will turn to my own discipline of history and how that's affected at least my approach. I will discuss Ukrainian studies, which I have been active in a number of institutions in helping to develop. This relates to a great degree with relations with community, perhaps greater than in many other academic fields, although there are quite a number of others we can argue also have some relations with community. And certainly this lecture occurs because of that relation with community. But I added one other element, which maybe was unexpected by those who invited me, and that's the pursuit of the future. And the reason I add that is I think the tale of Ukrainian studies and my own studies of the past was always related to a future we hope for, a future that was hoped for in which we would have contact with scholars and others in Ukraine, and in many cases in which we hoped that that scholarship that was produced here in North America would someday be of use in an independent Ukraine. And I think we have to admit that, and admit that if those who chose to call then therefore our activities politically inspired, to admit a certain part of that. What I could not expect is that this would occur at such a time of Ukraine being under invasion. And I think we can, in a way, look at this and how it relates to this topic if we look at two recent sessions that were held on the situation in Ukraine. The Harriman Institute at Columbia ran a session called The Assault on Ukrainian Studies. It was a session which argued that Putin's manifesto that Ukrainians do not exist as a people, and indeed later that Ukrainian history is demoted to a pastiche of various stray thoughts that come in many ways from the minds of radical Russian nationalists or imperialists or other such groups. And therefore, the field of Ukrainian studies was under attack. I urge you to look at that video, particularly because it also is a challenge to colleagues in North America who frequently, and especially those in Russian studies above all, who have not paid, I think, appropriate attention to the accomplishments in Ukrainian studies. The other video that I urge you to look at is a session that was organized by the Association for the Study of Nationalities on Voices from Ukraine. It is a video of 6 young Ukrainian scholars, one of whom was in flight, one of whom was in occupied Kherson, and others of which were looking at what their future would be. It is a video which shows us the tremendous accomplishments of young scholars in Ukraine, fully attuned to international research, doing their research on a high level, and indeed being able to say that much of their research, and most of them were social scientists, had understood or given the data, the hard data, to understand what we are seeing now. That is the patriotism throughout Ukraine, including in its south and eastern territories where many people speak Russian. And in many ways, these young people regretted that not only abroad, but even in Ukraine, not everyone had understood the changes since 2014. I also thought of what will their future be. And next month, and the months after that. And one of the topics, the hardest of these, is having to flee once again, which is in many ways a constant story in the development of Ukrainian studies. And when I turn to that, I think of what was the first great emigration, and the first great political emigration is that of Philip Orlik at the beginning of the 18th century after the Battle of Poltava. These were groups who tried to disseminate information on the Ukrainian cause and interest various governments in the possibilities of an independent Ukraine. It was an emigration which reached from Istanbul all the way to Paris in its impact, but it was not especially related to academic life and to research. And if we want to look at that beginning of academic life and research as an emigre experience, I think above all, we can think of Mykhailo Drahomanov, perhaps the most brilliant political thinker Ukraine had in the 19th century, certainly one of its major scholars, who after 1876 and the second series of bans on the Ukrainian language and culture in the Russian Empire, left to emigration, going to Bulgaria, to Switzerland, and then Bulgaria. And in that emigration, developing Ukrainian research on Ukraine that was top-notch, and in its intellectual heights also influenced a whole generation in Ukraine, especially in the Western Ukrainian lands under Austria-Hungary, which had greater freedom of access to literature. So we can see in this great scholar already the connection with political life. In a certain way, this theme of migration and movement in order to carry on academic life was part of the career of Mykhailo Hrushevsky. When we think that in the early 1890s, he emigrated from the Russian Empire to the Austrian Empire to take up a chair that became a de facto chair of Ukrainian Studies, as well as to become the most prominent member and head of the Shevchenko Scientific Society, a civic organization that was a scholarly organization within Austrian Galicia. I think of Shevchenko, of Hrushevsky in this, as well as because it was through this emigration, he was able to write his great history of Ukraine in the Ukrainian language and publish it, something that would have been impossible in the early 1890s in Galicia, in the Russian Empire. And with that, perhaps I would read just a short passage, Hrushevsky writing in 1913. He writes in the third edition of his first volume of the history. And this was a man who continually examined sources and brought new material to his work. True, the decline of Ukrainian national life is now largely behind us. Each year we see significant progress in this respect. National consciousness and social activism are reviving, and traditions are being reborn. The perception of Ukrainian history as a single, continuous, and uninterrupted whole that takes rise in its beginnings, or even before the beginnings of historical time, and proceeds through all the vicissitudes of historical development until our own time, is becoming ever more deeply embedded in the national consciousness and ceasing to appear strange and heretical, even to foreigners, as it did a decade ago, when this work began to appear in print. The first attempts to link into an organic whole the earlier periods of the historical development of the Ukrainian people with what were generally recognized as Ukrainian times were met with distrust or even indignation, as a ridiculous whim, as a display of hidden bias, as the influence of politics on scholarship, or as the manifestations of Ukrainian separatism. But I dare say that less than a decade from now, the concepts of Ukrainian history as an organic whole ranging from the beginnings of the historical lives of the Rus tribes to our own times, will appear just as normal to everyone as the interpolation of Ukrainian episodes into the traditional scheme of the history of the, in quotes, Russian state seemed 10 years ago, and still seems to people who have not yet had the opportunity to ponder the matter. Of course, Hrushevsky was in a way too optimistic, as we know from his own development. In a certain way, his work and the work of Ukrainian academics of the period before the First World War can explain, make it possible for us to understand why then major groups attempted to establish an independent Ukrainian state in 1917-18, of which Hrushevsky became the head. And why at this time, large segments in two empires thought of themselves as one people. And although that state failed and Hrushevsky went into emigration, he later returned to Soviet Ukraine, a quasi-Ukrainian state or political entity during the period of indigenization or Ukrainianization of the 1920s. Of course, only tragically to be destroyed by Stalin in the early 1930s. But it once again shows us this relationship between the academic life and political aspirations and views of history. And Hrushevsky, of course, was expressing views current in the late 19th and early 20th century in the attempt not to make history solely the history of rulers and states, but also of peoples and cultures. Who would think that in 2022, you would have not only the dictator and war criminal heading the Russian state, but I'm afraid a much wider circle that still would question whether Ukrainians are a people apart from Russians, or that Ukraine has a culture or a language. Now, I said I would be speaking of my own development and how this relates to Ukrainian studies. I realize now that I was fortunate in the misfortune of many who had to flee Ukraine at the end of world or through World War II, or had to take up refuge in North America. An exodus of scholars from the old world, many of whom in my career were of many, many nationalities, most of them from the eastern parts of the European continent, and among them a large number of Ukrainian scholars. They enriched immensely North American intellectual life. They founded the studies of East Central Europe and Russia throughout North America. They were people of cosmopolitan culture who knew many languages and contributed immensely from the traditions they brought from a Europe then in ruins. But I'll concentrate specifically on the Ukrainians among them. I mentioned the Association for Nationality Studies, which is now one of the most active organizations within our field. I think we should always remember that it was founded by Stepan Horak, a Ukrainian refugee who spent much of his career as a librarian, not with a regular academic position, and then later with a teaching position. And in its early phases was viewed as the enterprise of a few emigres who were peripheral to the mainstream of studies. In time, that organization moved and became the center, a central part of our studies. I'll also mention a number of names that I realize we are a diverse group that gather for this lecture. Our academics will know the names quickly and be able to rattle them off. Once our community knew them well, but as time passes on, that generation passes on, and another generation of the community must remember them. I had the privilege of knowing and taking in some of the traditions of Alexander Ovloblin, George Shevelyov, Ihor Shevchenko, Omelyan Pritsak, George Lutsky, Ivan Lesyak Rudnitsky. I owe them and many, many others I am not mentioning a tremendous amount in having introduced to me various disciplines and understanding and immense body of knowledge because of the many, many languages and cultures they understood, but still then placed in a context related to Ukrainian history and Ukrainian studies. Above all, Professor Ivan Lysyak-Rudnitsky is a founder of the study of history at the University of Alberta, and we are very grateful to him for that work. I also benefited from a number of institutions of these people, and I didn't understand fully what displacement meant, how their worlds had fully been crashed in the point when I was a student or when I went to these organizations. I, who was born in North America, of parents born in North America, of a much more stable life, to realize what it took for these people to continue intellectual traditions and found institutions like the Ukrainian Free Academy of Sciences, the Shevchenko Scientific Society, the Ukrainian Free University, and the institution Prologue in New York, without which I could have never written my senior thesis at Princeton. Prologue is the most interesting of these. We now know where its funding came from and see the connection with the CIA, something that many would find difficult to take. But we can all remember, or I can remember, a Prologue which in the late 1950s and early 1960s was producing a digest of the Soviet Ukrainian press, was making it possible for people who knew no languages to understand what was going on in Ukraine. I think its contribution to the field was great, but it was also related to the Cold War, my next point of what influenced my life, career, and the field. The Cold War and the development of the antagonism between the Soviet bloc and what I would call the free world, be willing to call the free world, in many ways shaped the field. For me personally, my first political memory is the Hungarian Revolution of 1956. And I remember being our Hungarian neighbors, but also Ukrainians gathering together with them and staying up a whole night in hopes that this was the beginning of the rollback. The rollback, of course, that we know that was never to come. It also meant, because of the Cold War's divisions, that those who studied Ukraine were often cut off not only from source material and archives, but also from scholars working in the field in the country they were studying. It made, when later exchanges came about with the former Soviet Union, it made a situation in which some of us were never permitted to work in archives or in manuscript divisions, in which the Soviet ability to decide who could come on an exchange or not could influence an academic's career, and certainly influence where you stood in the field. And then the third point I think of importance is that Ukrainian studies throughout the period I observed it was trying to move towards the mainstream. And that this move towards the mainstream was not only a movement by academics who wished to do this, but by a broader community that saw this as important. If we look at the multiculturalism movement in Canada and the Ukrainians' role within that movement, I think we can all see how important it was for the Ukrainian community both to move fully into Canadian life, but also through academic institutions to become fully part of Canadian academic and cultural life. I observed in the United States the Ukrainian Studies Fund, the organization that from 1957 collected many millions and millions of dollars, which eventually created the Ukrainian Institute at Harvard and its chairs, as well as many other Ukrainian programs at Columbia and many other institutions. a mass movement of 15,000 people who endowed chairs in an institute at Harvard. So that community involvement was crucial to the Ukrainian studies moving into the mainstream. On the other hand, the interests of community and academic life diverged, as town and gown often do. And this was not always a symbiosis without friction. Now, if I look back at where the career that I have followed had its roots, I think one thing that I was very moved with in reading Professor Manoli Lupul's memoirs, which I suggest you all read, is his very clear explanation that in rural Alberta, you grew up in two worlds as a Ukrainian-Canadian. The Ukrainian world that surrounded you in language and culture and traditions from family and neighbors and all around you. And then you walked into a schoolroom where you were part of British Canada and nothing Ukrainian would ever be mentioned. I think in a certain way, I saw this in my own school in the US. It turned out to be a school which in the 1920s was formed with an Americanization program. And indeed, my father and aunts and uncles had gone through the Americanization program, and I was still being taught by the same teachers in the 1950s. The only other bit of my past I will bring to you is that I must have been 10 or 11 when I saw the Black Deeds of the Kremlin and leafed through a book on the Ukrainian famine. A book which, of course, had pictures, which probably I looked at more carefully than read at the point, but remember the great impact it made on me. And only realized later that this kind of work, this production, and above all, translation into English, gave me some knowledge that my professors later at Princeton or at Harvard did not have. There are those who later admitted they didn't like the title, so they never opened the book. And I think later in all of my life, it will show me why you should be open. Now, I am a historian, but my first degree was from the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton, which was an undergraduate major. I did it in sociology and was involved with people in political science. I mention the name of that institute, which no longer exists. Woodrow Wilson's name has been removed now. We know things about him that people did not know or chose not to know at a certain period of time. And I think this is also very useful for those of us in Ukrainian studies. Little did I know in my years at Princeton about the racism of Woodrow Wilson. It shows how many societies have to uncover parts of their past. But what I above all think of this time was, it was political science, which in many ways was leading the field in Ukrainian studies. It was Sovietology. It was crucial books like Yaroslav Polensky's on the Second Soviet Republic that taught us much about Ukraine. It was the writings of John Kolaski, our Ukrainian communist who went to Ukraine to study and saw the reality of the 1960s in Ukraine. And my own work at that time was on dissent in Soviet Ukraine and the Ukrainian intelligentsia that had been formed after the Soviet period. It was a work which let me go at least to the Soviet Union on an exchange to study Russian language, and therefore as well to see Ukraine for the first time. It was a work that my professors the thesis advisor, Alan Kassoff, has passed away recently, to whom I owe such a debt of gratitude. But I later found out many years later, a very prominent professor, James Billington, you may know him from the book, The Icon and the Axe, later Librarian of Congress in Washington, wrote that my work, which won the first prize at the school, was remarkably objective for someone being written by someone so recently from Ukraine. my great-grandfather on my paternal side had come. So it showed what you faced in Ukrainian studies, and many others faced much more than I did. And what I might say of this period is that the political interest in the dissident movement in Ukraine is undoubtedly what drew me to the field. Were it not for the writings of the Shevchenko, I don't think I would ever have gone into the field of Ukrainian studies. I went on to London, the School of Slavonic Studies, and that was my turn to history. Sent by the Fulbright, I was later able to see legendary figures such as Hugh Seton Watson, who understood, and from his father, who was so important during the Versailles Congress, that nations and states were not necessarily the same. And that was very important for Ukrainian studies. It also was the time that opened up to me the world of Vyacheslav Lipinski, and I was introduced to him by a Polish professor who suggested that I read this important political thinker, but above all, historian who reinterpreted the social structure of the 17th century in Ukraine and gave a new vision of the Khmelnytsky revolt that became an important part of my research. But what I was entering, little noticing it at this time, was the field of early modern studies. It is only quite recently that I realized that it was only a decade or so before I was taking up the field that early modern studies became a field. And that also shows us how often we have blinders, assume things were always as they were today. They were not at that time. It was, in the 1960s, the in-field in historical thought. Our debates over the crisis of the 17th century, pan-European expressions, breaking down national borders in historiography, all went on studying revolts and changes in this period. And of course, Ukraine had one of the greatest of these revolts, largest and indeed most successful. It allowed me to tap into, I think, a broad field of history and showed why Ukrainian studies should not be carried on solely in Ukrainian institutions away from a wider historiography, and the chance that a new generation had. Above all, my experience at Harvard was seeing mainstreaming occur in new ways. In a way, the Harvard Institute was an amazing combination of politics and scholarship. Omeyan Pritsak, who was above all the moving force of this, to the Ukrainian community explained that if you want to someday regain an independent Ukrainian state, look to creating a culture that is world recognized. And you can do this through academic life. That is, many donated for political reasons. But on the other hand, Pritsak believed that scholarship always must be kept apart from political influences. He was a positivist in many ways, and he, like the people who trained me, believed that a historian encountering sources could find the truth. It was a very different world than the world of postmodernism and many of the trends that we have had since then. Based firmly on sources, believing in scholarship for scholarship. But above all, what Pritsak did was enter through many, many other fields, the introduction of Ukrainian studies, and gather a younger generation of graduate students who were part of that field. He was in many ways rebuilding a scholarly world, and it was only later that I realized that how many of the things he did were just carbon copies of institutions that he had encountered back at the Shevchenko Scientific Society or in his studies at German universities. Indeed, Pritsak at that institute put up at least 50 pictures of the major Ukrainian scholars to whom we were supposed to have a genealogical connection. But above all, in the 1960s and late 60s and early 70s, we had great hope that the changes in Ukraine that had occurred in the 1960s and the production of books on a new scholarly level would mean there would be a new level of scholarship coming from Ukraine. It was a hope that was to be soon smashed. Harvard was a place where people had heretical views, whether they be Prytzak's Origins of Rus, which many disagreed with, or Edward Keenan, my thesis advisor's assumption that the correspondence between Andrei Kurbsky and Ivan the Terrible was not authentic. Indeed, those in the Russian community who disliked this conclusion intimated it was the Ukrainian friends of Keenan that had given him this strange view, which showed how scholarship still connected with political life. But above all, Harvard was a place which was created by the dedication of the Ukrainian Studies Fund, people like Stepan Nechevich, who devoted their life to collecting for those chairs and institute. And above all, it connected with a community through a summer school, which at its height had over 150 students each summer coming to take Harvard courses to learn about Ukraine. Ukraine was then on the Charles River and not farther away. Major world events were to change my life in scholarship and to change Ukrainian studies. From the invasion of Czechoslovakia into 1968 to the crackdown of Ukrainian scholarship in 1972, we were suddenly to see our hopes dashed for any change within the Soviet bloc. Indeed, had it not been for Poland, where I was able to use archives and sources, I would not have been able to write my thesis since I was not permitted on the American-Soviet exchange. And I think a great debt of gratitude to Ukrainian studies is owed to Polish scholarship. Above all, scholarship of the medieval and early modern period, which by heroic effort, Polish scholars were to keep on an international level and as open fields. I can give a name of 20 major Polish scholars, all of whom helped in the development of Ukrainian studies and to whom I owe a debt of gratitude. I will only mention Zbigniew Wójcik at this moment in time. But above all, they were attuned to the Annals School, and therefore, in a way, as they influenced scholars in Ukraine, were of importance. I think a question we must ask in Ukrainian studies is, were we missing something as we were creating these institutions? Was Ukraine disappearing from much of the scholarly field, above all in the period of the 1970s and 80s with the rise of the revisionists, when somehow the need to pay attention to Ukraine seems to have decreased over time? I was privileged to see great projects, above all the study of the famine. I have seen the many myths that developed around that field of study of the famine, assumptions that are made today by scholars in Ukraine, that who first propagated it, why it came about, why the figures of 7 million first arose. And fortunately, further research can bring back that. One of the most heroic efforts I've seen lately was last week, when we ran a panel in memory of James Mace that was run by our HREC representative in Ukraine, Ludmila Hrenevich, because she was not going to stop scholarly work, even in the case of evasion. And there were attempts to stop this research made by the UN mission of the Ukrainian Republic, who made their threats. And fortunately, the professors at Harvard did not go along. I also was proud at the Harvard Institute that when the millennium of Christianity came, the most high-level projects were thought of at that institute. And the Ravenna Conference, which resulted in a magnificent volume in Harvard Ukrainian Studies, was created all in the study of the medieval period. But let me turn to Canada, where I've spent much of and by now more of my scholarly career. Above all, the Jacyk Centre came about because another patron, in this case, Peter Jacyk, believed that there should be a historical studies center. And in the days of the late 1980s, the province of Alberta still understood it should further education by giving matching funds. Would that those days would return. And above all, Ukrainian Studies came about in Canada with the multiculturalism movement, and the pride of the Ukrainian-Canadian community was that the government would fund study of Ukraine, that fully they were part of a Canadian life. It is not as if Canada did not have problems in the field. Those of us involved with the famous, to us at least, Toronto chair controversy of 1980 saw the last gasp of a British world that still did not want to let in Wagish people. And certainly my memories of the 1980 events do not speak well of academia in certain ways. One, its desire to keep community out, but two, its closed nature of not willing to open its mind to the opportunities afforded by a new field, and as well, a desire not to lose students to a new field. Indeed, in those days, and I can point people to the letter, it was said that the Toronto had perhaps made a mistake by allowing Jewish studies, since that had meant too many Jewish students had taken those courses and moved away from other courses. I came to a Canada in which the CIUS, founded in 1976, was undergoing the completion of its great project on the Encyclopedia of Ukraine, which had been a tremendous collective work of the Ukrainian diaspora in creating that encyclopedia. And I saw as well organizations like the Canadian Foundation for Ukrainian Studies, parallel to the Ukrainian Studies Fund, but with a Canadian aspect, and that is that one could turn to government as well for support. I arrived in a Canada in which national history, as it once had been taught and it generally accepted, was now under question. In a new intellectual climate, which called on historians to study history in new ways, and those only increased. It both dealt with the concept of what a nation is, what the relation is between modern nations and earlier periods, but is also questioning, was nation the proper category, or was even state the proper category? This then made a need to look at historical patterns in new ways. Frequently, I think, people went to extremes to exclude another study. And I had to explain to many, as we were beginning the translation of Hrushevsky, why in this new age, when my good friend Mark Van Hagen could write an article in Slavic Review, Does Ukraine Have a History?, which dealt with all kinds of transnational, subnational, other kinds of history, why still national history could play a role. Above all, in the case of Hrushevsky, because of his huge use of positivist bent and use of sources, but also because within those 12 massive volumes, there were many explanations of source material useful for those who either believed in national history or did not. Little did I think yet that we would still see the rise of Putin. But I already saw that there would be gradations, that certain national histories and cultures, and particularly those who had states, but in particular in the case of Russian history, would be accepted a priori by many colleagues who would not deconstruct the national paradigm, and Ukrainian history might be. Of course, it's important to deconstruct and reconstruct in all of our historical debates. But then above all, I saw the great changes that occurred in 1991 when CIUS was involved in very directly in Canadian recognition of an independent Ukraine, a story I will tell if those would like to know, and in which for the first time, those of us who had been not allowed to work in Soviet archives could get to the sources. We could also contact those scholars like Isayevich and Dashkevich and all of those we had hoped to get in touch with 15 years earlier, and finally deal with them in a normal scholarly exchange. CIUS was above all important in supporting both Ukrainian scholars. There was a point where I think the newly formed center had 15 to 20 scholars working in archives in Poland that we were able to fund in the first or second year after Ukraine became independent. Of course, the dollar was big then, and the zloty at that point, not so. And we were able, in a way, to help in the building of institutions. And we are very proud these institutions are part of CIUS today, or they are institutions with whom we cooperate. We were able then to see new historical discussions in history wars, particularly between initially the old Soviet paradigms and the new national paradigms, but one that increasingly became enriched. We were fortunate to observe that new people would come to the field. I always think that Natalia Yakovenko's appearance and her study of classical languages that made early modern Ukraine a leading field in early modern studies in Ukraine was a great gift we all had. And today we are just another part of taking debates, joining the debates that go on in our new internet and other ways. I think particularly of Natalia Starchenko and her discussions on Hrushevsky, Lipinsky, various visions of social orders of the past, in which we realize we are only an appendage. We have seen contemporary history, or at least post-World War II history, or history of the interwar period, studied anew in Ukraine. And we have above all seen new cadres emerging. When we look at our graduate students today, they are almost all from Ukraine. The field has opened up tremendously by now social science playing a leading role and people being able to go to Ukraine. But it has also benefited history. The fact that our colleague Mark van Hagen from the 1990s got involved with Russian-Ukrainian encounters and studying as well, helping us in reaching Russian historians with some knowledge of the Ukrainian past, and founding the program at Columbia is, I think, a case in point, or developing it. It was not founded by him, is a case in point in time. And there, of course, Ukrainian community played role, as well as the institutions, the organizations I've discussed. But above all, as Ukraine has opened up, colleagues in our field who once would have gone to Moscow and Leningrad, later St. Petersburg, now go to Kyiv to study. They do so for a number of reasons, but above all, because archives are opened in Ukraine, and Ukraine is an open society, and that's revolutionized our field. In conclusion, I will say a few what ifs. What if are there things we should have done differently? I would have argued from my Harvard experience that I wish that Professor Jacyk had been more open to the study of the 20th century in the development of our field. In other areas, and we can think of the University of Michigan as well as a number of others, it did develop. I believe we should have realized when Conquest's book came out in 1986, this was not the end of the discussion of the Holodomor, but the mere beginning. And that we should have consistently carried on with all the new sources we now had, with all the new voices we could bring to that field. And it would have, I think, helped the field of Soviet history considerably. I think it has still not come to terms fully with the Holodomor. It above all, as we have dealt with this, we have helped it, and I think been intermediaries between our colleagues and Ukraine, but we have also dealt with community and Ukraine. And we have also stood at times and had to stand that freedom of inquiry must be a basis of what we do, and that the historian who is wrestling with sources must look for truth according to the light he or she finds and carries on. Then I think of the phrases of the people dealing in Ukraine now. And one of the ones I picked up, I believe from President Zelensky, perhaps otherwise in the discussion, was, if not us, who will do this? We are seeing our brothers and sisters in Ukraine defending the free world, freedom of inquiry, liberty, decency, because they feel they must do this. They have taken on that. I think when I looked at those voices from Ukraine, I realized how much that is true. But what I will say, just for our purposes, with all of the, at times, difficulties and internecine battles and problems that Ukrainian studies had during the time I was involved with it, I always think, if not us, who? If it had not been for an emigration or a Ukrainian community that could find younger people who would carry on an academic life, even though it was not the most lucrative or even at times possible careers. If we had not had a community that was willing to go forth and fund the various projects in the field, how much poorer Ukrainian studies would have been in 1991 when Ukraine became independent. And if not the people I met through my long career who had carried on, some of them very intensely identified with Ukrainian studies, some of them as those who outreach from the field. If they had not done that, I don't think that Ukrainian studies would have developed to the point it did. What we now must do is really evaluate quite coldly what are the real achievements, and deal as well with those things which were not done, and deal with those that were not effective. Because I fear the Putin ravings still could find resonance even in parts of North American academia, or certainly until the Ukraine has so heroically stood up for all of these values. I think many, even in our academic field, have not paid appropriate attention to Ukrainian studies. So that when Columbia did its panel on the assault on Ukrainian studies, it was aimed at what the Putin criminal regime and those Russian circles around it are trying to propagate. But it was also a nudge to a field within North America to open up to new perspectives and to be both critical of them, but at least to take them seriously. And so with that, I will finish my personal view. It is only the view of one of the people involved in the field. There are many more to whom you can turn, including at our institute, its former director, Zenon Kohut, many others in the field that we have in Edmonton, many that are in Harvard, and all over North America and back in Ukraine. And if they add their voices together, we may get a project that I know our colleague Volodymyr Kravchenko is very interested in, a history of Ukrainian studies. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank, very much for this excursus into your own personal experiences within the field of Ukrainian studies. Sitting here and listening to your reminiscences and the story of your journeys as it unfolded, I just feel how privileged we are to work with you, who in fact has been directly involved in all the various phases of its involvement in the North American continent. You are a person who is intimately of the Ukraine in the United States. That is exactly what I would like to encourage everybody to do right now. We have Q&A session open here, so we hope to see some questions popping up there. We can
Coming in and out.
also probably scan the chat as set goal for identifying to outline the involvement of the Ukrainian studies under your watchful eye, so to speak. You've mentioned the migration movement and how much the immigration and migration has affected the involvement. You've spoken, of course, of Cold War, of they've pushed towards mainstreamification. You've come back to 1986, the publications by Conquest, by the crackdown in 1972 on Ukrainian intellectual life in Ukraine. And if it wouldn't be for the historical moment in which we are in, and if you would have been giving your lecture a year ago, you probably would have finished it very differently, given the fact that we would have been in the celebrations of the 30th year of Ukrainian independence. But now we're in 2022. Would you not reflect back on what we've been doing in the field and say that one of important themes maybe can be also labeled as resistance? You've pointed out that our field oftentimes is positioned to become politically informed. And to me, the work which has been happening outside of Ukraine throughout that period you've been discussing truly was a scholarship of resistance. This is simply my comment on what I've found out you doing. May I ask you a question which will bring us back to your personal experiences? And I'd like us to come back to the context of your life, the United States versus Canada. You did speak about community involvement, community participation in the buildup of Ukrainian studies on this continent. What if you would be asked to reflect on what were the differences in the United States in the relationship between the Ukrainian studies in their effort to mainstream mind in the community versus Canadian context in which the academic Ukrainian studies were evolving, of course, also in the context of relationship with the community? What would be the key differences, of course, given the fact that countries are different and perhaps communities, Ukrainian communities were different?
No, I think there is a basic difference, and the difference is also the evolution of the two communities. So it is study these communities is not my major field of specialty, but I've certainly lived it and seen it. I think it is fair to say, because of the way the American-Ukrainian community developed over time. Initially, of course, it's older. It was urban much earlier. Mm-hmm. And it tended to pass from generation of immigrants to generation of immigrants' leadership in the community. That is, even though American immigration was closed off to Ukrainians largely in 1924 and did not really resume till after World War II, very generally from my observations, it was a generation of immigrants themselves who had led the community in the 1920s and 30s that then passed off leadership to the post-World War II generation. And the community, although it viewed itself as of importance as an ethnic community in the United States, did not specifically tie its Ukrainian identity to an American identity. Mm-hmm. If it tied it to one identity that I can see, that part of the community, and remember that in the older community, there had been a large pro-communist part that disappears after World War II very largely in the US, it tied itself much more to the ideology of captive nations and the free world. And of course, it hit its height of influence in the United States in the time of Lev Dobransky in the early 1950s with the discussions. It had influences later, but in that sense, the American-Ukrainian community, and by the way, and Dobransky is one of the exceptions to this rule as someone born in the US, but I think my still holds. As I have observed it, what has been interesting to me in Canada is that the concept of multiculturalism and the movements that occur in Western Canada influence a much wider community. And so it's tied with their Canadian identity as well. And so the Ukrainian identity then fit within a Canadian identity. The other is the relative influence of left and right within the two communities and the way they develop, which I think also reflect the differences of Canadian national identity in the 1970s, their different relations to the Vietnam War. But above all, of course, the deep feeling of Ukrainians in Canada of this pioneer tradition. Now we would call it settler tradition. We are now revising this as what it was. Gave that community a different basis in the way it thought of itself.
Thank you very much. This is very inspiring to hear your comments on these questions. I apologize for technical challenges here. I've been, I think, even logged out of the meeting for about 10-15 seconds. I may not have heard your last couple of sentences, but nonetheless, let's just look around the room. Do we have any other questions? I do have many more myself. Just a second. Right. We have a question coming from a Facebook. Frank, that's for you. Reflecting on 2021, having been Canada's 50th anniversary of multicultural policy, how have you seen Ukrainian studies change in reaction to intercultural or multi-ethnic studies? Though it may be that you've already addressed this question a bit while I was logged out of the room.
No, I think not on it. Okay, so as I say, not my field of specialization, but just of observation. The ethnic studies that existed in the 1970s when multiculturalism was founded is not a vibrant field today, as far as I can see. The other issue is Canadian studies itself, which I think has gone under transformations, and not always positive ones, I might add, in the degree to which Canadian history is developed. In contrast, of course, what has grown as with the change of the concept of multiculturalism within Canada, from one of what might be called retention and maintenance of cultures to one of integration of cultures, also has been involved the issue of multiculturalism becoming more and more attached with varying groups, racialized groups that are not part of what now seems to be a dominant group. That is, so Ukrainians have shifted in where they fit. And above all, the biggest change we have seen, and really are seeing, is Canada finally coming to terms with its Indigenous history. And this, as I have said or mentioned, is extremely important for Ukrainian-Canadian studies and for the study of the Ukrainian community in Canada, because it opens up a whole new history that was forgotten, I think, to a considerable degree, the relationship of that land and of the groups who lived on it, and one we are now exploring now. And in the past year, CIUS has conducted, I think, very important studies of this.
Thank you very much. That was indeed an important question for us to address, especially for those of us in Canada. I thank you again for to share with these. And if you can take an opportunity, has been, and the Hungarian events have been affecting you as a young scholar, that something that intrigued me as a scholar myself, someone who is interested in in the exploration of Ukrainian studies in North America, I sure have access, as well as my colleagues, to reflective papers to analysis of what the Ukrainian studies have been like. But I seem to have less understanding what potentially have been the relationships between the Ukrainian scholars in North America and those, say, representing Latvian studies, Estonian studies, maybe Belarusian studies. You've mentioned Polish, you've mentioned Jewish dialogue with these particular groups and studies, but what about others who may have been also experiencing Cold War in terms dissimilar to how Ukrainians have been?
Okay,
Were there conversations
so
about
there's two issues I think that have to be taken up. One of them is the relationship of the communities to each other. And the other have been the academic relations, which I think have developed somewhat differently. And here, my observations are largely from the U.S. because this is where I think I observed it in an earlier phase. Obviously, the Baltic communities and the Ukrainian communities were very close and worked closely together. Even though the linguistic barriers were great, they were less great, of course, with Lithuanians, strangely enough, through Polish, but that being another story. And of course, in some cases, through other such languages. The Balts, of course, were in a very different position as communities because the Soviet occupation was not recognized by the United States or by Western countries. Therefore, they had a different position in which to defend on it and go through similar process, a Lithuanian chair in Chicago and other such groups. When I mentioned contact with Polish groups, there were contacts with specialists in Polish studies here in North America who were very numerous, but the major ties that, at least in the Harvard days, I could see were between Poland and scholars in North America. It was scholars from Poland, above all, who were interested in it. And of course, the placement of a Ukrainian institute at Harvard was a good way. An invitation to Harvard was something that Polish scholars who were able by the 1970s to begin to come in larger numbers. And it must be remembered that Professor Zbigniew Wójcik was the first visiting professor, second visiting professor of the chair of Ukrainian history. In fact, Alexander Hloblin taught on it earlier. But it meant that a Pole was invited to teach. And I think those laid very good relations. I would say the same, it was true to a degree with Israeli scholars, being closer than with Jewish studies forming in North America. That was often simply because of the preferences of Jewish studies. If Jewish studies, if Professor Jacyk didn't want much study beyond 1917, there were those in Jewish studies who didn't want anything beyond Maimonides studies. So they were not as closely involved. And then, of course, we have development of the Armenian studies. It was the Armenian chair at Harvard that gave the invitation to Professor Dashkevich to come to Harvard. Of course, the Soviets never let him out, but of course, a Ukrainian chair would have been totally impossible to do so. I think the most complicated issues that have to be looked at are Russian studies. And of course, Russian studies is not such an ethnic issue. Since most people by the time I'm involved are not themselves Russian, although they may have been Russocentric in their visions of the field. And here we can see many changes that occurred. And I think one of the most interesting of them is the changes of someone like George Vernadsky, who obviously was of Ukrainian background, we would say, or Little Russian if he would have preferred that. Some of it was related and was in North America already before the Second World War and went through a Ukrainian phase. He was crucial in getting out the English translation of Hrushevsky at Yale Press. He wrote a biography of Bogdan Khmelnytsky. But if you examine closely his work, this was also related to the rise of the Ukrainian question in the late 1930s, and above all, the emergence of Karpatska Ukraina, of Carpathian Ukraine in Czechoslovakia. If you follow, I've done this in one of my articles, the various editions of Vernadsky's History of Russia, which was very generally used, you will find that they change in their attitude and terminology towards things Ukrainian, reaching a high point in 1938, 1940, when it was assumed the Ukrainian issue would be a major issue. I think in Vernadsky's world, what he wanted was a non-communist, free Russia and Ukraine somehow linked to each other, and hence was more open to the Ukrainian question at that point in time. I have not studied as closely the works of Nicholas Razanovsky, but this would be, I think, another interesting issue. And of course, when CIUS ran its various conferences, the Russian-Ukrainian conference that was first run was the most difficult because of the negative statements of Alexander Solzhenitsyn, and largely who had problems, and I assume some, as I remember, of mixed ethnicity, but had problems accepting Ukrainians. These problems, I think, run more generally within certain Russian cultural milieus and traditions, above all, and I think we will see emerging then. And then, of course, as Russian studies changes, we're really talking about people who happen to be studying Russia and pay more or less attention to Ukrainian studies over time.
Thank you. Thank you very much. There are questions. I have a question here in front of me. It comes from the Facebook viewers. It appears that Ukrainian studies related disciplines like Ukrainian language have suffered at universities in the past while with low enrollment. Would there be a way you would recommend a revitalizing of these types of courses?
Yes. First, the problem of languages in general hits us. Too many universities have done away with language requirements. Too many have assumed that the study of English alone is all they really need, or in Canada, if French is added because of certain political and career considerations, French may be added to that as well. So this has, in general, I think, been a decline in study of language. Maybe I'm, for the first time in my life, beginning to use Google translations, and I can assure everyone here that they're often terrible. But at any rate, this has switched it. The specific nature with Ukrainian, I think, has also been, particularly in Canada, a change in the constituency. That is, we are fortunate that there are bilingual schools in the prairie provinces. There are active Saturday schools. CIUS is very active through its Ukrainian language education resource center, like Ukrainian Education Center, in carrying on these. What we have added, if we've lost in numbers, and by the way, in the US, it is not clear we have lost in numbers because Ukrainian has been added to universities where it was not taught before. Of course, it wasn't taught very generally before, but in Canada, we have clearly lost in numbers on it. We have partially lost because, of course, Ukraine opened up and there are ways of studying Ukrainian there. But it's something we must concentrate on and will become more and more important at the moment. I think also what I had hoped, and I hope will continue, as Ukrainian becomes a functioning real language in Ukraine in more spheres of life, therefore the need when dealing with Ukraine to know Ukrainian will increase. It was hard 15 years ago to tell an average student at Columbia, you should study Ukrainian and not Russian to go to Ukraine if Ukrainian was not generally understood or not the language that was predominantly going to be reached. So there are de facto issues of to what degree the language functions and the degree you learn it. Others learn it for other reasons as well, and we encourage that to fully understand the culture. I think the language issue is particularly of importance for Ukrainian-Canadian studies. You cannot have Ukrainian specialists in Ukrainian-Canadian studies who does not know Ukrainian. And this must just be accepted as a normal language requirement for anyone who really wants to pursue the field seriously.
Thank you. Another question, which is, I'm usually asked when I work with my students, and it concerns the actual label or the title of Ukrainian Studies and what can be put underneath and what can be understood under that. In Ukraine, we have been seeing a dialogue and conversations unfolding around the idea that Ukraine is a multinational, multicultural, or multi-ethnic society, that a title Ukrainian encompasses variety of cultural groups and languages. And yet in North America, when we operate with the label or adjective Ukrainian, especially conversing with people outside of Ukrainian studies, outside of Ukrainian communities, immediate understanding of the label Ukrainian is to imagine ethnic Ukrainians as members of the community and whatnot. So when it comes down to Ukrainian studies, it's a question to Frank Sysyn going forward. What should constitute its focus in lieu of these two different understandings what Ukrainian could mean?
I think there is no question. The issues are both issues that both have to be considered, both have to be studied, and both have to be put in context. Ukraine is a multinational or multicultural society in the same way most societies are studied. I think that French studies or German studies today would require one to also pay attention, particularly in Germany, to the large number of people of Turkish and Syrian background, to large Muslim communities, if one understands contemporary Germany. If one wants to study German folklore of various regional dialects that are more traditional, one has other ways of looking at it. I think one of the major revelations to many in the field of political science, sociology, other such fields over the past tragic events have been that their suppositions of what Russian speakers, how they would respond, are not necessarily so. And of course, in Ukraine, I think as our colleague Volodymyr Kulik and a number of others have shown very well, the question of, because of multiple descent in many cases, but also just because of the way ethnicity is defined in Ukraine, we have seen a great shift towards Ukrainian ethnicity, much greater than that of use of Ukrainian language. Now in Ukraine, which, we know the horrible destruction that Putin has wrought on the Russian-speaking areas of Ukraine in the name of Russian speakers and Russian ethnic groups. Whole societies are being destroyed. I think above all, we should pay attention to these cultures and societies and how this went about. And that's why I was so stunned by the young scholars in Ukraine who already were with it and understood this, and we're already doing this, and should go further with doing it.
Thank you very much. We're coming up to an hour and a half of our committed time for this event. I do want to pass on a comment to you, Dr. Sysyn from Facebook. It was a pleasure to catch you live, Uncle Frank. Your works are invaluable for Ukrainian history, Lori Terry. So I'm glad to see this comment puts a smile on your face. And we are, as I said, wrapping up our event. There are questions which we will pass on to Dr. Sysyn after we will end this lecture. Allow me to take over and say a few thanks to various parties who have contributed to the organization of our annual Shevchenko Lecture 2022. First and above all, Dr. Sysyn, thank you for finding time and focusing on your important topic and career, very much entangled with the Ukrainian studies on our continent. Mr. Boychuk, thank you very much for bringing greetings on behalf of Ukrainian-Canadian Professional and Business Association of Edmonton, also on behalf of Alberta Foundation for Ukrainian Education Society. I thank my colleague Jen Fedun for hosting this event. Dear guests and people in the audience, thank you for being with us. Please stay with us. Stay tuned. CIUS is organizing many events directly in response to the ongoing onslaught on Ukraine. You can find the updates on these and others on our Facebook, but also on our website. We do have a few annual lectures upcoming as well. Stay tuned, follow up on those, and stay safe until we connect next time. Thank you very much.